Good morning, everybody. How is everybody doing? Fat and sassy. There you go. I know the feeling. I know the feeling. That's me. No, did not know that. Well, I would have said something to her. Hmm. The Miss Binkley, that grandmother. I'll say. Hmm. Hmm. Well, I saw her, Miss Beulah, say May. Last time I saw her. Hmm. Mm-mm-mm. Well, I hate that. Are there any announcements? They just told me that Miss Beulah Binkley, this would be Michelle's grandmother. This is her father's mother. Sweet lady. Passed away Friday. Anything else? Other things that are on your announcement sheet would be announced. I don't know of anything else to be updated. All right. Are you turning your Bibles to Ecclesiastes 9, verse 7? Ecclesiastes 9, verse 7. Good to see you. I suppose you had good turkey day. You know, I was telling somebody I weighed last Sunday and thought I'd weigh this Sunday. Got up this morning and said, nah, not going to do it. Don't want to know. So, but it's a time to eat, isn't it? Time to eat. Solomon in Ecclesiastes 9 spends time talking about death and dying. Really, not one of our favorite subjects, to say the least. But it is a reality of life, isn't it? And we all acknowledge the fact that we're going to die. Edward Young once wrote, he said, all men think all men mortal but themselves. And there's a lot of truth to that. We're going to live forever. And a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to my son and I said, I said, it's just hit me recently that there's more behind me than what's in front of me. And I said, it's beginning to sting a little bit. And I said, you're too young to understand that. And I said, because I was too young to understand it till about 6 months ago. And then I said, I realized it, even though people have been telling me that. But so it's not a subject that we like to think about. But it is a subject really that we probably should spend more time thinking about than we do. We should spend time thinking about it from the standpoint of we should say, okay, how does it affect the present life that we have? And I'm one of these and I think that Solomon sort of says it in many ways in the next couple of verses that we're going to look at. But I'm one of those that say, okay, let what's going to happen affect what is happening today, but don't let it affect what's going to happen today in a negative way. We can curl up in a ball and we can get in our rooms and we can just dread the day that death comes. And there are folks that do that, and it's their way of coping. It's their coping mechanism that they have within them that does that. But that's a sad way to live life. That's a sad way to spend the time that you have. And Solomon basically says, get out and enjoy it. Look at what he says beginning in verse 7. Go, eat your bread with joy. Drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. Enjoy the present. Don't brood over what might be in the future, because let's face it. We look at it from a future standpoint, and we say, okay, as we grow older, where do we spend most of our time? Most of our time is spent at home, at church, and in the doctor's office, right? We don't like that prospect. I don't know anybody that does. And I think that's a correct prospect to have. But Solomon says, whatever your days and ever how long they may be. I was reading something this morning very quickly, but it said that the average lifespan of a male now is 85 years of age. But when I look at the obituaries from different funeral homes that I have been with through the years, I find plenty of people in their 40s and 50s that are passing away. Plenty of people. And so you say, okay, live this life. Solomon says, go ahead and enjoy it. Go ahead and eat your bread with joy. Drink with great merriment. God desires you to experience life and to enjoy it. Yes, within his confines. Now let's say that. I've had individuals tell me as we sit and talk about the Bible, and you sit and tell them that, well, here's some things that you might not can do, and here's some things that, are in your life that need to change. God wants me to be happy, they tell you. Yeah, God wants you to be happy, but let's consider several other things. Well, what's that? Let's consider the happiness of God. Let's consider the fact that God has set limitations, and God has said this is the way I want folks to behave. And when we don't, think about what sin does to God. Never thought about it in that way. Gotcha. We have to think about it in that way. But Solomon says, God's accepted your works. God desires you, yes, to enjoy life, of course, within his circumstances. And he says, let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. And there's differing thoughts with regards to this oil here. Is it the oil that one say is anointed with when they are going to take under a special task, such as a king? When one became king, he was anointed. Most seem to believe that it has reference to sort of the celebration of life that occurred in sometimes, and could refer to possibly when feasts were undertaken and celebrated, that you sometimes would anoint individuals that would come to those feasts. And so it seems that it might be that, but Solomon doesn't give us a clear understanding, probably because those of that day did understand it. And Solomon says, just let it be done joyfully, because then look at what he says in verse 9, live joyfully. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity, for that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Enjoy, spend time with, live joyfully with your wife, spouse. Interesting, isn't it? If you look at what Solomon says, look in Proverbs chapter 18 for just a minute. Proverbs chapter 18. I want you to look in verse 22. Solomon says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Kind of interesting when you think of Solomon, because if you're there in your Bible, now turn to 1 Kings 11th chapter. This is the same man. We made reference to this last week, but I want to do it again. In 1 Kings, the 11th chapter, beginning in verse 1, it says, but King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughters of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Ammonites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you should not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. It's interesting. Solomon prizes, now we're not talking about the way he viewed women, just the fact that he seemed to prize marriage, and marriage really is a lifetime commitment. He talks about all the days of your life, appreciate and enjoy. And we talk about we see the verse in Genesis chapter 2 where when God makes Eve out of the rib of Adam, and he says, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto him a wife," verse 26, "and they two shall become one flesh." We read that and we see those things. We understand what the Bible says with regards to marriage being a lifetime commitment. Well, Solomon, even though he had all of these wives and all of these concubines, Solomon, at least in word, maybe not always in action, but at least in word, tells others, he says, enjoy your marriage, enjoy your relationship. For he says, this is your portion in life and in labor which you perform under the sun. This is part of your life. And so he goes on, and let me go through at least verse 10. He says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no work, nor device, or knowledge, or wisdom in the grave where you're going. He says, do what you can do. And do it with joy. You enjoy doing what you're doing. None of us really enjoy work. I enjoy my work. But many go to work each day and don't enjoy what they're doing. But they don't enjoy life. And it seems as if, at least to me, this verse is all encompassing, not just of your job, not just of your work, but of everything you do. Enjoy your life. Whatever you put your hand to, do it. But do it with the best of your ability. Do it, as he says, with all that you have within you. And then he talks about the last part of this verse becomes one that is discussed often. He says there's no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. There have been those that have looked at that last part of that verse and said that once we pass from this life, that is the end. That there is nothing beyond this life. That it's finished. You're annihilated. There are those from a religious standpoint that will say you either go to heaven or you're annihilated. There are those that say complete annihilation, and there are those that just say, well, it seems as if Solomon says, you don't know what's going to happen, and there's no knowledge, there's nothing where you're going. One could look at that verse that way, but that doesn't correspond with the rest of the Bible. And so we have to say, well, okay, what is a good way of looking at this verse that corresponds with what the Bible talks about with regards to dying and the hereafter and knowledge, and our knowledge, and things of that nature? Well, look at this verse and see what it says again. He says, for there's no work or vice or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. In other words, the labors that you have here end. He's not, I don't think, really saying, and like I say, you got to look at it within a broader context of the Bible itself. He's not saying you're not going to know anything. But he says, with regards to the wisdom and everything that you have amassed here, all of the physical things and all of the things that you have amassed through the years. I was thinking about this the other day. I've been, excuse me, I've been blessed to know, and I'm sure you have too, but I've been blessed to know some men that have spent lifetime in pursuit of knowledge. And in many ways, I've seen that sort of as my life, know more about the Bible and be able to explain it better. And so you've probably known those people too, that they've spent their life just knowing, well, when they pass away, sad to say, that knowledge that they have goes with them, right? It's gone. Unless they've passed it on, it's past. And there are probably some things that they learned that they never conveyed to others, either wrote it down or told anybody or expressed it. And they never got together all of their facts and let others know. I was thinking the other day, I told Suzanne I wanted a book for Christmas. I wanted several, but I narrowed the list down. One of the books that she got me is from an old professor, old teacher of mine. He wrote it right before he retired. Now, I've seen him several times since he retired, saw him just a couple of months ago. And he had written things through the years and done many things, but I got to thinking about it. And it was interesting of how many of my old professors that right as they retired released a book, wrote a book. And I think it was probably, if I look back at some of them, it's like, I remember as I read some of that being said in class. But then I thought, well, there are others that I had, other teachers that I had that are still alive. They still have a wealth of knowledge in particular things that some of it, I was able to receive because I sat at their feet. But some of the ones that are younger than I that maybe didn't have them as teachers, they didn't get to hear. And it would be good if they would hear it. Now, why aren't they writing books? Well, maybe they're get up and win. I don't know. Maybe they can't find a publisher. Maybe they can't find somebody to back them. Maybe they just don't have the time. No, that's their business. That's up to them. But it is to say that the knowledge that we've gained, it ends with us. And so that's the way I look at that verse. Anything else in those verses anybody would like to say? Okay. Well, it begins then in verse 11 by really saying one thought. Now, he's going to say it a lot of different ways in verses 11 and 12, but he's going to really say, well, really through the end of the chapter, he's really going to say, life's very unpredictable. Isn't life unpredictable? It is, isn't it? You can plan to do something today, and when you're planning tomorrow, and you can plan to do it, and then when tomorrow gets here, things change, right? You just can't predict. You can't even predict the weather. The weatherman can't even predict the weather, right? I mean, it was supposed to rain yesterday. Well, it eventually did, right? I think I've shared with you the time many years ago. I was at Waverly at the time and went home for lunch, and I was sitting there watching Bill Hall and the weather, and Bill was talking about how it was raining cats and dogs in Waverly. We didn't receive rain in any of that area. I don't know where he got his information, but it was bad wrong, and it was supposed to be current. I'm not talking about Bill. Bill was a good old guy. But it is to say that, life really is unpredictable. We never know. You can't guarantee what's going to happen. You can say, well, I'm planning this, but you can't guarantee it because life changes. And so Solomon begins this thought. He says, I returned and saw under the sun. And remember, that's the phrase, here upon the earth, things that were happening. That the race is not to the swift, nor battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. Our abilities, if you look in verse 11 and verse 12, maybe we should go on and read verse 12. For man does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. Our abilities, or lack thereof, our abilities don't guarantee us success. They don't really guarantee us anything. When you look at what he's saying here, he sort of gives us some random thoughts and random events in life just to show us how unpredictable life is. The race is not always to the swift. Well, no, we know who won the race between tortoise and hare, right? Race is not always to the swift. Strong don't always win. The riches of a man, riches don't go to a man that understands it all. He says, but look at verse 12. He says, fish sometimes, they're caught in nets. They're swimming along, they're feeding, they're doing their natural everyday thing, and all of a sudden a net comes by and catches them, or birds unexpectedly are caught in a snare, a trap. And so then he makes the application, last part of verse 12. Sons of men are snared in evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. Chance and opportunities, the providence of God, the events in our life change, don't they? And so we also know that we just kind of have to go with it. We do know that we're not in control, but we do know that God is in control. I like, and I can only tell this because he said it so many times out in public, but when I was working with the Waverly congregation, I was the assistant minister, that Lee would come in, and you could usually tell when he and his wife had a little disagreement before he came to the office. He would come in, talk to me for a minute. He'd say, "Oh, Paul," he'd say, "this world and one other, and then I'm going to start bossing." Well, we know who's in control of this world. God's in control. But yet we know that we're not. Any thoughts there? Well, this wisdom that he says, this wisdom I've also seen under the sun. It seemed great to me. A man of wisdom, desired wisdom when given the opportunity to, what do you want from God? Well, wisdom. He says, there's a little city, though, with few men in it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, built great snares around it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that same poor man. He's telling something. It's interesting, and I'm not sure. I get his point as we're going to finish reading this. I get his point, but it's interesting how that he's just been coming out with these wise sayings, and all of a sudden he tells a story. Well, maybe it's to illustrate the point, maybe it's to make another point, but I think it goes along with what he's saying. He says, here's a poor wise man. He says, no one remembers the poor wise man. He says, the king, he tells this story. Here's this city. It's a little city. Got a few folks. King comes in. King sets a snare, sets a trap all the way around it. Folks are basically hemmed in. They have to give up. He says, but there's a poor little man that's wise in his years. He's able to deliver the city. And he says, no one remembers. No one remembers this poor little man that saved the city. We don't know how he saved the city. We don't know, did he save the city by his words? Did he save his city by arming them? Don't know. That's not the point Solomon's trying to make. Keep reading. He says, verse 16, then I said, wisdom's better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much. You see, he says there's a battle between wisdom and strength, might and the mind. And he says, mine's better. Not everybody has that great power, strength physically. He says in verse 17, words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard. So now, all of a sudden, here's what he's saying. You better listen to what I'm telling you. You better give heed to what I'm telling you. How many of us told our children that? You better listen to what I told you. Were you listening while you were growing up? Are you listening now? He says, wisdom's better. Wisdom's better than what? Well, it's better than physical might, as he talks about the weapons of war. But then he makes an interesting statement as he's trying to show the value of wisdom. He says, one sinner can destroy much good. That's true. Give us some examples, say, in the Bible of individuals that maybe just one individual on their own destroyed much good because of what they did. Anybody? Cain. That's a good one. Hadn't thought about that one, to be honest, but it's a good one. Who else? Let's start with the A's. Adam would be one, right? Wherefore by one times. Well, you could even really say three. Adam, Noah, and Jesus. Cain's a good example of what I think Solomon's talking about. Adam's a good example. How about Achan? Remember when the children of Israel marched around, they didn't get everything that they were supposed to, that they weren't supposed to take anything, and he did. And then later, Israel is defeated at Ai. Why? Because he has something in the bottom of his tent that he's not supposed to have. And so they're defeated. So he would be a good one. Anybody have any others? Saul? Yeah. Anybody else? Well, sometimes we all suffer, and sometimes we suffer because of the wrong choices of others, don't we? I was thinking of a man the other day. I performed his funeral several years ago. He was getting ready to retire, and he had gotten in his job where he was more of a consultant than he was anything. And he was going one day. He worked for the gas company for years, and so he was going one day to the gas company to talk to them. And as he was going, somebody pulled right across his path, and he ran into them. And they were not hurt. Matter of fact, they were a little inebriated. Well, they were a lot inebriated. He was hurt. And hurt fairly severely. Spent some time in the hospital, and as the days and the years progressed, things began to mount up. Many of his problems and many of his plans that he had made for his life in retirement got thwarted because of the problems that resulted from the wreck. Bad choice of two individuals, husband and wife, actually. Bad choice of two individuals that created problems for a man for the rest of his life. Sometimes we suffer because of the wrong choices of others. And Solomon says you need to choose wisdom, you need to listen, you need to do what's right. You need to understand that life is fleeting, enjoy life, but yet be smart about it. Anything else anybody wants to add from this chapter before we move to the 10th chapter? In many ways, we are who we are based upon our heart's inclinations, right? What our heart wants to do. Well, that's kind of where we're going to go with this chapter in the 10th chapter. As Solomon talks about wisdom and foolishness, he's going to talk about foolish workers and foolish rulers. And he begins by talking about in verse 1, he says, dead flies putrefy the I can't say that word. That ointment, the perfumer's ointment. See, you know why I can't say it? It's expensive, and I don't buy it for my wife. Oh, we get her some every once in a while. But what did Granny call it on Beverly Hillbillies? Toilet water. Yeah, we get her some of that. And but he says dead flies putrefy the ointment, and that was true more so today, or in their day than today. We have a lot of things that remain for the most part now. Yeah, things do separate. You know, you ever keep honey long enough or molasses long enough, it goes to sugar, right? You you keep a perfume long enough, it will break down into its elements. And sometimes a vanilla smell will get too strong, or other things that are in that perfume. Well, dead flies, and that was a common problem in Solomon's land. Solomon's area was for flies and small, what we would call gnats, to be in that area and to die, and so consequently cause the perfume, if you will, the ointment, to break down, thus causing it to ruin. He says, dead flies, he says, they putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. And so the person with wisdom and honor needs to maintain her wisdom and honor. Not always easy, is it? We sometimes fail, and that's part of life. But he says, let's try to keep it as best we can. For a wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. You can argue the right and the left, the conservative and the liberal, if you will, on anything. But he talks about the wise man's heart. You got to understand, in biblical times, the right hand, as opposed to the left, the right hand was considered the one of power and might. It was considered the one of prestige, sitting on the right hand. Remember, Jesus even applied sitting on the right hand of the Lord. As opposed to the left was considered weak, or the left was considered not as strong, not as mighty, not as powerful. And so he says, the wise man's heart's in his right hand, the hand of strength, fool's heart's in his left. But even then, he says, verse 3, even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom. And he shows everyone that he's a fool. You are eventually found out, right? You are eventually found out. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are. You are eventually found out, figured out. Some may not always agree. I think of a young guy when I lived in Mayfield, Kentucky, and we had a young guy. We were trying out. We had about 3 young men come and give talks, give sermons. We were going to hire one of them for summer. Congregation always had summer interns. And so we had one young boy, and he told this story that was supposed to be a story of himself. And it was a story that I just didn't believe. No, sorry. It's too fanciful. There's too many holes in the story. Humble beginnings, gone to college, made good. No, didn't believe it. I didn't say anything. I wasn't in on the selection process. Elders, I understand, grilled him. And you got to understand that the story was so compelling. And when he got through preaching, everybody said, oh, he's the one. He's what we need. He's what our young people need. One of the elders did not agree with the story, did not think the story was holding up. The others were kind of, we're not sure. Sounds good, though. Sounds like and come find out, the elders said, no, we don't want him. We want somebody else. But in a few weeks, the young boy's story fell apart. And any good that he might have done in the future fell apart with him. You are eventually found out. And Solomon says, you're eventually found out. And so he says, be careful. And then he begins by talking about a foolish ruler. So he changes thoughts a little bit. So anything along that line? Well, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. No, I don't think so. Little s. There's an evil, verse 5, that I've seen under the sun, an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. And notice what he says. He talks about the ruler. He talks about the foolish ruler, the spirit of the ruler. He says he rises against you. Anger of a proud ruler. The anger of a proud ruler can sometimes rise against man and rise and overtake others. He says, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, don't leave your post. For conciliation, the word conciliation, excuse me, can have the idea of not just reconciliation from the standpoint of being made whole that way, but just from the standpoint of health and healing. And so he says here, he says conciliation, it pacifies great offenses. You see, there's an anger issue and there's a self-control problem. And he says, there is evil that I've seen. It's as an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity. Folly is exalted. Foolishness is exalted in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. The rich seem to have it all, but yet they really sit not as they seem. He says, I've seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. I've seen the high and mighty. I've seen the servants. And he says you need to be careful. Be careful of the proud ruler that won't listen. Proud ruler that doesn't take advice. The individual that lacks character and courage will eventually put his foolishness out, and folks will see it. And so he says, be careful. Be careful of these individuals. Be careful of what is seen as wisdom, but is not. Be wise in understanding. And so he goes on and he talks about the worker. He says, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. If an axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. A serpent may bite when it is charmed. The babbler is no different. The words of the wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of the fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth began with foolishness, and the end of his talk is ravening madness. The fool also multiplies words, and no one knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. Let's just stop there. I think the thought goes on really to the end of the chapter. But he begins, look at beginning in verse 8, he talks about the man that digs a pit. He's got to be careful to fall into it. You break down a wall. Well, there's a serpent in the wall, and so what does that serpent do? Well, it bites you. The man that is a stone, he quarries stone, it can eventually hurt him. And then he talks about what seemingly probably is maybe something we can identify with more, the idea of having a dull axe. You have to use more work when you got a dull axe than if you have a sharp one, or a dull knife, or dull scissors. My wife is in the process of putting out our Christmas stuff, and she was cutting ribbon the other night, and she said, I need a pair of scissors that works. And I said, well, there's 4 of them. They all work. What's the problem? I mean, they all, you separate it and you push it down and they go together. Oh, well, we'll see what we can do to sharpen them up. And so she says, Solomon says, we understand that process. Though you have to use a little more work. And so Solomon is saying, use your smarts. Use what you got. Use your common sense. You ever seen folks with a lot of book sense and no common sense? And then you probably seen the other way, people with a lot of common sense, but not a lot of book sense. And so he says, use what you got. Think about what you're doing. Notice what he says right there at the last part of verse 10. Wisdom brings success. Wisdom gives you a successful advantage. Use the insight that you have. Use what you've been given. Because he goes on to talk about, then beginning in verse 11, the serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. Serpent may bite when it's not charmed. You have to be careful, right? You have to be careful of playing with fire. Don't play with fire. You've heard that old admonition. Don't play with fire. You got to be careful. Well, Solomon is giving a warning here. Use what you got, but you got to be careful. You got to be careful with those that are around you. And the idea, you could apply this with charming folks around you. Charm those that are around you, because if you don't, they're going to come up and bite you. That almost, if you interpret it that way, it almost sounds like Solomon's doing what? He's playing the political card, right? What do politicians do? Whatever will make you happy and get me a vote from you, I will do to appease you, or tell you I will do to appease you. May not always do it, but I'll tell you I'll do it. And you could look at that and say, well, the individual has to understand that serpent it may bite you. So you have to charm it. The babbler, he says, is no different. The individual that he just talks. He just talks. My father had an expression for that. He used it on me every once in a while. He says, you're only talking to hear your head rattle. You ever heard that expression? I used it some when my son was little. You're talking just to hear your head rattle. In other words, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, the babbler, he's talking to hear his head rattle. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of the fool shall swallow him up. Seems like the fool has an advantage. So you got to be careful. You got to be careful what you throw out there. You got to be careful, what you present to others. And sometimes maybe it's good just to be seen as silent. We don't like to be silent. We like to add our 2 cents worth. But he says in verse 13, the words of his mouth began with foolishness, and the end of his talk is ravening madness. He's talking about the fool now. The fool, he says, he just simply talks, and he talks to hear his head rattle. The end of his talking is just madness. And then he goes on to say, verse 14, a fool multiplies his words. He just keeps talking. No man knows what he is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? In other words, the fool really doesn't know any more than the rest of us. And he doesn't know about the future. He doesn't know about what's going to happen. He has no idea. I had a guy one time. Bless his heart, he was a simple guy, simple man, about my age, not highly educated. And when he was in school, he wasn't successful. Just put it like that. Well, one day he looks at me and he said, "You know what this winter's going to be like?" And I said, "No." He said, "It's going to be bad." How do you know that? Well, yesterday was cold, and it was the 1st of November, so it's going to be a bad winter. I said, what's that based on? Well, it's just going to be a bad winter. Okay. Well, admittedly, in some ways, he might have just been trying to make conversation, and that was fine and good. But he was telling everybody, it's going to be a bad winter, it's going to be a bad winter. And it was a milder winter. Kind of noted that. But he had nothing to base his thesis on. He had nothing to base he had no premise. His premise was, well, it was cold yesterday, it was 1st of November. Okay. Well, there were 8 fogs in August, but it didn't snow 8 times last year. You know, you got to be careful with what you say. So the fool, you know, he rattles, his head rattles, and he multiplies his words, but he's not true, and everyone knows that he's true. He goes on to say, verse 15, and we'll stop right there. The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. So the foolish, what do they really know? Solomon, in his wisdom, is trying to explain the difference between wisdom and fool, and so be careful. Because remember, he just said earlier, you're going to be found out. So use the wisdom that you have wisely. We're all wise in different areas, in different ways, in different means. Every one of us. The young man or the man that predicted the bad winter based upon the fact that 1st of November it was cold. There are other things that he taught me that I didn't know. It's to say that we all have our areas. So we need to appreciate those areas. But we need to be careful who we listen to. And so, as he talks about and compares wisdom to folly, he's going to kind of bring this all to a close as he's trying to get, I think, Solomon he's trying to get his children, those that will read, if you will, his words here, to understand you need to listen and you need to practice what is wise. And the same is true for us as Christians today. You need to listen and you need to practice what God says. Not what somebody else says, not what the preacher says, not what some Bible class teacher says, but what God says. And so we listen to God. And wisdom then is putting his words into actions and living the life he's told us to live. Anything else? All right. Randomly put. Great. I need to fill out a chapter. It makes you wonder, from our perspective in modern society, it makes me wonder what was the mental state of the man at this point in his writings. Yeah. That's always been my take as well. I haven't read that anywhere. I'm glad you have. Now I can say it. But yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's an excellent point. True. Anything else? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day with the blessing of it. Thankful for the opportunity that we've had this morning to speak the word. And while we look at wisdom and follow and to you and follows your will, help us to be individuals constantly walk the path that you have set forth, that we listen to your word and that we respond in the way in which you have us to respond. Watch us, that you bless us. This is our prayer in Christ's name, amen. Proverbs chapter 1, read that. That's an interesting proverb. You might hear something about it in a Sunday or two.